Imagine you are sitting on your couch at the end of a long day, just, scrolling through your social media feed.
Right, the classic evening doom scroll.
Exactly. And you spot an article. Maybe it's a bit controversial, or maybe it's from a foreign news outlet, or perhaps it just presents this geopolitical theory you haven't really considered before.
Something that just catches your eye.
Yeah. So you hit retweet, or you bookmark it simply to save it to read later. And then, literally without warning, that single casual tap on your screen lands you 1 year and 8 months in prison for, quote, picking quarrels and provoking trouble.
Wow. I mean, it sounds suspiciously like the premise of a dystopian science fiction novel,
Ugh.
but we are actually looking at a documented reality here.
Yeah, that is the exact situation a scholar named Dr. Jingyon Chen found himself in. He forwarded posts on Twitter, which included content from official U.S. government accounts, and suddenly he was facing these incredibly serious criminal charges.
Right.
The prosecution's core argument was that he knowingly spread false information that caused severe social chaos.
Though the documents we are analyzing highlight a pretty crucial discrepancy there.
Huh.
I mean, there was absolutely no evidence presented of any actual social chaos resulting from his posts.
Not at all.
Right. Nor was there any concrete objective proof that the information itself was definitively false at the exact moment it was shared.
Yeah, and before we go any further, I really want to be incredibly clear with you, our listener, about the parameters of our discussion today.
Very important point to make.
Yes, because the mission of this deep dive is absolutely not to debate the politics of this specific case. We are not here to take sides on the legal outcome or to advocate for a cause or, to judge the political systems involved.
We're taking a strictly analytical approach.
Exactly. Our focus is entirely on this fascinating stack of psychological analyses of the case. We are using this as a lens to explore a much deeper universal mystery, like how do individual human beings versus the massive institutional systems that govern them process truth, intent, and information differently.
And this matters to you directly, no matter where you live. Because, I mean, we are all currently navigating this era of unprecedented, relentless information overload.
Oh, for sure. It's everywhere.
Yeah, so understanding how our brains, and really the bureaucratic systems we interact with every single day, categorize what constitutes a truth and what constitutes a threat is arguably the ultimate survival skill in the modern digital world.
Totally.
What we are really observing in this case study is a fundamental structural collision between two entirely incompatible ways of processing reality.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have this scholar, Dr. Chen. He's browsing, he's forwarding posts. The legal system looks at this action and immediately interprets it as, you knowingly spread false information with malicious intent.
Right.
But if we, strip away the legal jargon and look strictly from a psychological standpoint, what is mechanically happening in a person's brain when they hit forward on a complex piece of information in a crowded digital feed?
So to get to the bottom of that, we really need to apply the framework of cognitive psychology. The prosecution's entire argument hinges on that one specific word, knowingly.
Right, like he had absolute certainty.
Exactly. The legal system operates on this rigid assumption that knowing is a binary state. You either possess the absolute truth or you are deliberately lying. But cognitive science completely rejects that binary. It introduces this principle of bounded rationality, which was originally formulated by Herbert Simon.
Okay, and bounded rationality essentially dictates that our logic has severe biological and environmental limits, right? Like, we aren't supercomputers capable of running infinite algorithms before making a simple choice.
Precisely the opposite of supercomputer, actually. In a highly complex digital environment, literally no individual has the working memory or the processing speed to verify every single piece of data they encounter.
It's just impossible.
Right. Our brains physically cannot do it. And this limitation is severely compounded by what's called cognitive load theory.
Which is...
Well, when the information environment is incredibly dense picture, the endless scroll of a social media timeline, our brain's working memory hits its physiological ceiling very quickly.
Oh, I feel that every time I open an app.
Right. So when people encounter and share information outside their direct, narrow area of professional expertise, they almost never act on absolute, verified certainty. They're operating on a heuristic of plausibility.
That makes perfect sense when you think about how people actually use these platforms. It's a digital sandbox, or like a public bookmarking tool.
Yeah, exactly.
You see a headline that challenges a preconception, you throw it in the sandbox to look at later, or maybe just to see how your network reacts to it. The act of sharing isn't this sworn affidavit endorsing the content as empirical fact. It's an act of information forging.
That's a great way to put it. And psychologists actually categorize this specific behavior as an epistemic action.
Epistemic action.
Yeah, it is a cognitive behavior driven purely by the desire to alter the environment, to uncover new information, or to just simplify a problem-solving process. The goal is exploration, not persuasion, and certainly not malice.
Okay, I have to push back on this a little bit, though.
Sure, go ahead.
Dr. Chen isn't just your average person doom scrolling on a commute. He's a highly educated scholar. Shouldn't a scholar, of all people, hold themselves to a much higher standard of knowing before they broadcast something?
It's a fair question.
I mean, shouldn't he be the one meticulously verifying the empirical truth of a claim before clicking share?
That intuition is incredibly common, but it actually leads us to one of the most counterintuitive findings in the sources. This draws on psychologist Eric Kuglonsky's theory, the need for cognitive closure.
Oh, okay. And that's the psychological drive for a firm answer to a question, right? Like a deep aversion to ambiguity or confusion.
Yes, exactly. And the intensity of that need dictates how a person processes the world. Now, as a highly educated academic who literally spends his life researching complex theories, Chen is a textbook example of an individual with an exceptionally low need for cognitive closure.
Wait, low, which feels entirely backward at first glance. You would assume an academic demands firm answers all the time.
You'd think so, but no. A low need for closure actually means you have a remarkably high tolerance for uncertainty. To a mind like Chen's, the world is rarely black and white. He operates in this fluid landscape of probabilities.
Interesting.
Yeah, a brain with this profile can hold multiple, even wildly conflicting theoretical frameworks in its working memory simultaneously, without triggering an anxiety response at all.
Wow. So he's just comfortable sitting in the messy gray area.
Exactly. For someone operating with this open cognitive architecture, forwarding an article doesn't translate to, I have verified this is 100% factual. It translates to, here is an anomalous data point. Let's keep it in the mix and see how it interacts with other data.
So his cognitive system is just pluralistic, open-ended, and entirely comfortable resting in the unknown.
What's fascinating here is the sheer architectural mismatch between the individual's brain and the institution processing him.
Oh, yeah.
The legal system demands a binary output. Did you know it was false, yes or no? Are you guilty or not guilty? But Chen's psychological reality simply lacks that binary axis.
Because he lives on a multidimensional spectrum of probability.
Precisely. The system is forcing him to translate his open, complex epistemic process into their rigid binary code. And when that translation inevitably fails, the system interprets the failure as intentional defiance.
The legal framework literally lacks the vocabulary for epistemic exploration, so
Right.
it defaults to the only vocabulary it has, which is malicious intent.
Right. It's complete communication breakdown.
Here's where it gets really interesting. If Chen's mind is this complex, open network that views information as a sandbox for exploration, how do we explain the judicial system looking at the exact same digital behavior and seeing a deliberate, calculated threat?
Yeah, it's a massive leap.
I mean, structurally, how do we bridge the gap between bookmarking a geopolitical idea and being convicted of picking quarrels and provoking trouble?
To answer that, we have to completely shift our analytical lens.
Right.
We have to move from the psychology of the individual to the psychology of massive institutions.
Right, looking at the system itself.
Exactly. We need to evaluate the human beings operating inside the machine, the police officers, the prosecutors, the magistrates. Given your familiarity with Daniel Kahneman's dual system theory, we can apply that directly to their cognitive state.
Okay, so we are talking about system 1, which is fast, instinctual, and automatic, versus system 2, which is slow, deliberate, and analytical.
That's the one.
Obviously, the theoretical ideal is a justice system that operates exclusively on system 2, careful, evidence-based, methodical reasoning. But the sources suggest that's absolutely not what's happening on the ground here.
No, not at all. The environmental realities of the institution make pure System 2 thinking nearly impossible. These judicial and law enforcement officers are functioning under extreme constant pressure.
Right.
They face crushing caseloads, severe hierarchical accountability, and this ingrained institutional culture where the primary directive is risk avoidance.
So when the human brain is subjected to that level of chronic stress and environmental pressure, it simply doesn't have the metabolic resources for System 2 thinking.
Exactly. It defaults to the survival mechanisms of System 1. It relies on heuristics.
Mental shortcuts.
Yes, mental shortcuts. And in this specific high-stakes environment, those shortcuts inevitably trigger systemic cognitive biases. The most prominent mechanism activated here is the fundamental attribution error.
Okay, let me see if I can apply this. If these officers are stuck in a System 1 survival mode, they just don't have the bandwidth to analyze Shen's complex context.
Right, they can't.
They aren't looking at the nuances of the digital environment or his low need for cognitive closure. They just see an action that causes a blip on their radar, and they immediately attribute it to a flaw in his character.
You hit the nail on the head.
The shortcut is just, he shared this, therefore he is a bad actor who wants to cause chaos.
The situational context is entirely erased in favor of internal blame. And once that System 1 judgment solidifies, the brain initiates a secondary mechanism to protect that judgment.
Which is?
Confirmation bias, heavily fueled by motivated reasoning.
Meaning, once the institution slaps the label of threat on his file, their cognition just completely narrows. They only process data that validates the label.
Exactly. They hyper-focus on the mere act of forwarding the posts, framing the click itself as empirical evidence of picking quarrels. Meanwhile, the institutional brain actively filters out all counter-evidence.
Like the fact that nothing actually happened.
Right. It ignores the fact that there was zero measurable social disruption. It ignores the fact that the original sources were verified official accounts. The institution is highly motivated to prove its initial instinctual judgment correct, because reversing that judgment requires a cognitive effort that the system simply cannot afford.
I want to pause and look at the implications of this for a second. Are the sources suggesting that these officers and judges are acting out of pure, calculated malice?
That's a crucial distinction.
Like, are they consciously sitting in a room deciding to frame an innocent scholar just to flex their power?
If we maintain the strict, impartial psychological lens our sources demand, the data points away from conscious malice.
Oh, real?
Yes. What we are observing is an adaptive psychological survival mechanism deployed by individuals who are themselves trapped within a rigid, unforgiving structure.
Wow. So, treating a citizen like a threat is actually an anxiety reduction tool for the bureaucracy.
Yes. Recall Eric Kruglansky's need for cognitive closure. While Dr. Chen has a remarkably low need for closure, the institutional machine operates on an exceptionally high need for cognitive closure.
That makes sense.
Institutions are structurally driven by risk avoidance motivation.
Mm.
To the institutional mind, ambiguity and uncertainty are practically indistinguishable from risk, and risk must be neutralized immediately to maintain order.
So, by looking at Sen's highly ambiguous exploratory behavior and forcing a definitive label on it, by declaring this is an intentional act to cause trouble, the system eliminates the ambiguity. It comforts itself.
Exactly. By constructing a clear, definitive narrative of malicious intent, even if that narrative is factually inaccurate, the individual serving the system regain psychological control over a chaotic environment.
Right.
Furthermore, it fulfills a profound psychological imperative known as system justification.
Which is the inherent human need to believe that the system you serve and the society you live in is fundamentally legitimate, just, and orderly.
Correct. If the officers acknowledge Chen's complexity, if they admit that the digital world's the gray area and his actions were just harmless exploration, they are forced to confront the flaws and the blunt force trauma of their own system.
And that realization triggers immense cognitive dissonance.
Massive cognitive dissonance. To avoid that existential dread, their brains take the System 1 shortcut. They justify the system by condemning the individual.
It is a terrifyingly efficient structural collision. I mean, you have an open cognitive system crashing headfirst into a closed, risk-averse institutional system. And to maintain its own psychological equilibrium, the institution simply processes the individual as a threat.
It's a tragic but fascinating psychological loop.
But this brings us to the human element at the very center of the collision. How does a human being survive being ground between these institutional gears without experiencing total cognitive collapse? We are talking about interrogations, profound isolation, and ultimate imprisonment here.
Typically, under prolonged exposure to that level of inescapable stress, a psychological breakdown is the expected outcome.
Sure.
We would anticipate severe trauma responses, perhaps PTSD, deep depressive episodes, or just cognitive fragmentation. Yet the psychological analysis of Chen's response reveals a remarkable deviation from that baseline.
Yeah, the sources emphasize that he didn't emotionally shatter. He seemed to undergo the exact opposite process.
He exhibited what researchers classify as post-traumatic growth, or PTG.
PTG. Okay.
Rather than his psychological architecture collapsing under the pressure, it actually galvanized. We can deconstruct how he achieved this through the framework of Viktor Frankl's logotherapy.
Ah, Frankl. The psychiatrist who survived the Holocaust and posited that the search for meaning is the primary, irrepressible drive of human life.
Yes. Frankl's central thesis was that a human being can endure almost any conceivable suffering if they can attach a profound meaning to it.
Right.
Meaning-making is an impenetrable psychological shield. During his isolation and imprisonment, Chen did not succumb to despair. Instead, he engaged in an extraordinary act of high-level meaning-making. He began writing these extensive, incredibly dense self-defense letters.
And these were not standard legal appeals begging for leniency.
Not at all.
The sources detail how he was actually applying Gödel's incompleteness theorem, complex network theories, and advanced physics to analyze his own legal predicament.
The application of Gödel's theorem is particularly revealing here.
How sick.
Well, Gödel essentially proved that in any sufficiently complex mathematical system, there are statements that are true but entirely unprovable within the rules of that system.
Oh, wow.
Chen used this theorem to argue that the legal system trying him was a closed logic loop, a system inherently incapable of fully processing the complex, open-ended truth of his digital actions. He used network theory to model how information actually propagates, attempting to mathematically prove he couldn't have caused the chaos they alleged.
That is why he wasn't just writing a defense, he was writing scientific treatises from his cell. It makes me think of like a bomb squad technician actively disabling a live explosive.
That's an interesting comparison.
Yeah, like instead of panicking about the danger, a technician uses intellectualization to just cut the emotional fair wire, and by disconnecting the panic, the brain is left entirely free to calmly analyze the circuitry of the bomb. Chen basically cut the fear wire and just looked at the institutional circuitry.
That analogy perfectly isolates the mechanics at play. He successfully deployed two of the most mature psychological defense mechanisms available to the human brain: intellectualization and sublimation.
Right.
Intellectualization physically separates the effective emotional charge from the cognitive appraisal of an event. It allowed him to treat his own terrifying imprisonment as a fascinating, abstract, academic case study.
And then sublimation.
Sublimation then allowed him to channel the raw, chaotic energy of his trauma into a highly organized intellectual creation.
Yeah.
He fundamentally shifted his motivation. He was no longer defending himself for a lighter sentence. He was creating a philosophical record for history.
He literally transformed his prison cell into an academic laboratory, and he was the subject of his own experiment.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this leads us to the final and perhaps most tragic psychological mismatch detailed in the sources. Because Chen utilized these incredibly high-level coping mechanisms, because he remained stoic, analytical, and operated on intrinsic historical motivation, the judicial system completely and utterly misread his emotional state.
Oh, man. So how exactly does a bureaucracy evaluate human emotion?
This raises an important question regarding the limits of institutional empathy. The sources highlight a cognitive blind spot known as emotional attribution bias. A judicial system operates on deeply ingrained scripts.
Like expectations of how people should act.
Exactly. It expects a guilty person to display remorse, to cry, to beg for mercy. Alternatively, it expects an innocent person to be panicked, erratic, and desperate.
Yeah.
When Chen presented them with a calm, highly abstract, mathematical deconstruction of the nature of truth,
The system didn't see a brilliant mind successfully coping with profound trauma. They just saw arrogance.
the system interpreted his emotional regulation and intellectual detachment as having a bad attitude. They viewed his calm demeanor as a stubborn, defiant refusal to admit guilt.
That is so deeply frustrating.
The tragedy is that the very psychological mechanisms that allowed him to survive his trauma intact were weaponized against him as behavioral proof of his guilt. The institution demanded a specific emotional performance, and when he provided a scientific thesis instead, the institution punished the mistranslation.
So what does this all mean? When we zoom out and look at the entirety of the psychological data, this case ceases to be just a legal file locked in a cabinet somewhere.
It becomes much more than that.
Right. It stands as a textbook, incredibly detailed example of a structural psychological collision. It illustrates exactly what happens when a mind that thrives in ambiguity, a mind built to explore the gray areas of probability, is forcibly processed by an institution that structurally demands absolute black and white certainty to survive.
And this is where the psychological mechanics connect directly back to you, the listener, in your everyday life. It is very tempting to look at the institutional behavior in this case study and judge it harshly from a distance. But cognitive psychology dictates that every single one of us acts like this institutional machine in our daily lives.
We absolutely do. I mean, you see it every single time you open a comment section.
Oh, constantly. We all rely on System 1 heuristics to process the deluge of daily information. We all fall prey to the fundamental attribution error when a stranger cuts us off in traffic, or, when someone posts a political opinion we find distasteful.
Yeah, we instantly assume they possess a defective moral character, entirely ignoring the unseen situational context of their lives.
Exactly. We routinely judge the motives of others based on our own internal anxieties and our own desperate need for cognitive closure, rather than expending the metabolic energy required to understand their complex, messy reality.
It is a profoundly sobering realization. And I want to reiterate for everyone listening that our objective today was strictly to unpack the psychological mechanics detailed in these sources.
Just sticking to the science.
Exactly. We are providing a scientific lens to view how information, intent, and truth are processed differently by human brains and bureaucratic structures. We are not endorsing any political viewpoints, nor are we passing ethical judgments. We are simply mapping the cognitive battlefield.
And the topography of that map reveals that the friction between nuanced exploration and the demand for absolute certainty is a universal human struggle, playing out literally everywhere from our personal social media feeds to the highest levels of judicial power.
Which leaves us with a final, somewhat unsettling thought to mull over as you go about your day.
Oh, what's that?
Well, if our justice systems, our corporate bureaucracies, and our social institutions are inherently structurally built on System 1 cognitive shortcuts, simply to maintain order and survive the overwhelming crush of modern information, will true, complex System 2 thinking always look like a threat to the establishment?
That is a fascinating question.
The next time you find yourself quickly judging someone's post online or demanding a simple binary answer to a deeply complex problem, just take a second. Pause the scroll. Ask yourself, are you actually seeing their intent, or are you just desperately seeking your own cognitive closure? Are you really searching for the truth, or are you just instinctively trying to neutralize a threat to your own worldview?